Hello, Prime Minister Trudeau. Thank you for meeting with me today. My name is Georgie Gardner, and today I will be presenting my design and proposal for the Royal Proclamation 2021 Wampum belt. Specifically, this belt is entitled the Tidal belt. This design attempts to communicate that present and future conditions cannot change successfully or significantly without first addressing the historical situations which have created them. It specifically addresses three main issues. However, this is not an exhaustive list by any means. It is a good starting place. These include legal domination, cultural assimilation, and the Indigenous water crises. The fact that the past shapes the present and the future is evident within the dimensions of the tidal belt. The belt is 88 beads by 23 beads, which signify important dates in the relationship between the Indigenous nations of Turtle Island and the Canadian government. 88, or 93 minus 1 minus 4, represents the Papal Bull Intercatera, which was issued in 1493. It legitimized legislative hierarchies, racial hierarchies, which will be discussed and expanded upon momentarily. 23, or 1 plus 9 plus 6 plus 9, represents the 1969 White Paper, which attempted to disregard and abolish treaties between Indigenous nations and the Canadian government, with the goal of assimilating and therefore eradicating Indigenous peoples by the year 2000. Contemporarily, the doctrine of discovery is used in Canadian courts to justify denying Indigenous sovereignty and existence of peoples who were the original inhabitants of Turtle Island. It perpetuates abuse through this doctrine by denying Indigenous land claims and basic human rights, including autonomy and self-determination. Judicial action is assimilatory in the sense that it requires Indigenous peoples to assimilate and redefine themselves in order for the law to apply. The white path running through the middle of the tidal belt originates from the Indigenous side, bisecting the Canadian government to illustrate that the path to harmony between these two parties is difficult, and it will continue to be difficult. It requires dedication to mending this relationship. It also acknowledges that Indigenous existence is not dependent on Canadians or the Canadian government. Therefore, it should not be treated as such. This naturally leads to the second issue I would like to discuss today, which is cultural assimilation. The red line on the one side and 14 different colored beads on the other side are representatives of the parties involved. The government is red to symbolize fire and the power fire has to maintain life and also to take life away. The Indigenous nations of Turtle Island are representative of 14 different colors. This is not an attempt to be an exhaustive list, but rather it is trying to move away from dominant misconceptions that all Indigenous people are the same. In other words, homogeny. The residential school system was one of many ways Canada perpetuated cognitive imperialism, terrorism, and assimilation. By separating approximately 150,000 children from their families, communities, and land, the government attempted to kill the Indian in the child through abuse and torture, sexually, physically, culturally, and emotionally. It resulted in the loss of traditions and languages and perpetuated cyclical governmental abuse and intercommunal poverty. This leads me to the third issue I would like to discuss with you today, the Indigenous water crisis or crises. This issue is a direct result, like residential schools, of either government action or inaction in terms of unkept treaty promises. The waves in the middle of the wampum are representative of the different stages of the relationship between Indigenous nations and the Canadian government. It also can be representative of the different emotions of water. For example, the wave, the undertow, the line with the bump, can be representative of the early encounters with early Europeans, seemingly innocent but deadly. The rip current can be representative of how domination and assimilation tried unsuccessfully to sweep Indigenous peoples out to sea, their languages, traditions, and cultures out to sea. Today is more similar to still water. That progression is promised, but Indigenous peoples should still be wary of trusting the Canadian government. The waves themselves have at least 5 beads between them to honor the 5 Great Lakes in Canada, the largest fresh water system in the world, interconnected by lakes and rivers. Also, 5 represents the 5,000 people who may be affected by one water advisory. The waves themselves are 12 beads in length, to be representative of the 174 water advisories in Canada in 2018. Though this may not be the most accurate number, it is an attempt to accommodate those communities who have little access to clean water yet are not on the water advisory list due to quick and temporary fixes that have taken them off of long-term advisory list and have put them on low priority. Although there is much more contained symbology and issues-wise within the tidal belt, it is necessary for time to start transitioning into redress. There is a circle which is 3 beads wide, surrounding all depicted within the tidal belt, and these 3 beads are representative of Haudenosaunee guiding principles of a good mind, peace, and power. These 3 guiding principles must be present throughout all stages of attempting reconciliation. Reconciliation will not be possible without all of these 3 principles actively being met and strived for. To begin reconciliation, the government needs to start fulfilling treaty terms before proposing new treaties, new terms, new promises, because Indigenous nations, they've already made promises with you. Why would they make more if they're just going to go unkept? And a good place to start is the numbered treaties, although I believe this should be extended to all treaties, but like I said, a good place to start is the numbered treaties. For example, treaties numbered 1, 2, and 5 need to have a family of 5 needs to be accommodated 160 acres per family of 5. And for other treaties, this term needs to be expanded to 640 acres or 1 squared mile. Again, these treaties need to be fulfilled. If annual monies is to be deposited to these Indigenous individuals, it needs to reflect current inflation. Treaties need to be fulfilled. We need to start with action, not with words, not with other promises. We need to start taking action. Now shifting into the specific issues I've discussed today, the Canadian justice system needs to be reformulated. Indigenous people should not have to abandon their identity just to have the laws help. Further, we need to identify unjust and racist precedent, which allows for the Canadian justice system to become unjust. Further, we need to identify harmful legislation, whether it's new, old, or proposed. And to do so, we need extensive Indigenous collaboration at all stages, so our Indigenous friends, leaders, Indigenous nations in general can be reasonably heard and accommodated. The government must do everything possible to put Indigenous peoples back into the position they were before government intervention. In terms of residential schools, the government needs to fund initiatives to bring back as many lost languages and traditions as possible. This requires extensive Indigenous collaboration and mentorship programs that allows Indigenous peoples to learn about themselves, their history, their communities, their families from people within their community. Specifically talking about survivors and the legal system, like I said earlier, we need to incorporate Indigenous legal orders into legal proceedings. Further, we must make available compensation for all students. All students suffered. That's a simple fact. There should not be an arbitrary standard of abuse that Indigenous students must have to receive or be entitled to compensation. The third and final redress issue, which will be discussed during this presentation, is about the Indigenous water crises. There needs to be a dramatic shift in water governance. Canada must empower Indigenous communities to come to their own solutions about their land. This occurs through funding Indigenous scholarship while also simultaneously promoting traditional modes of water governance, not favoring scholarship at all. Well, also, these solutions, Indigenous solutions, must be adequately funded so they can be implemented. Canada must refrain from imposing any developmental changes without communal, not individual, consent. And all around, there must be extensive consulting and collaboration with the Indigenous communities affected. This design advocates that the path to remedying violence and tension between the Canadian government and Indigenous communities is through focusing on unfulfilled promises rather than creating new ones. And it does so through the placement, design, and depictions, as well as the colors on the wampum belt. To obtain peaceful coexistence, Canada must fulfill its broken treaty promises, and it has to empower Indigenous communities, nations, and individuals. There must be legislative, cultural, legal, and resource decolonization for this to occur. Thank you for your time. I hope you have a good day.